We need this money really bad, right?
Right.
So the way to get it is to act like we don't need it. We assume a very casual, suave, debonair.
The Monkees sold 75 million records and beat the Beatles on the charts, but they weren't even a real band. In 1965, Hollywood held auditions for 4 insane boys and hired actors to play instruments they couldn't actually play. By 1967, one of them punched a wall so hard it almost went through a man's face. Another ended up in prison. And the biggest secret? The same guy who got mocked as a fake musician quietly created MTV, while the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame pretended he never existed. Today, we're exposing what really happened after the cameras stopped rolling. Davy Jones was just 18 when he stood on the Ed Sullivan Show stage on February 9th, 1964, performing I'd Do Anything from the Broadway musical Oliver. Minutes later, the Beatles stepped out before 73 million viewers, and Davy watched Beatlemania ignite right before his eyes. He had already lost his father in 1960, moved from Manchester to London, given up dreams of being a jockey, and at 16 landed the role of the Artful Dodger in the original West End production of Oliver. When the show moved to Broadway in 1963, he earned a Tony nomination for Best Featured Actor in a Musical. Yet he was still just another working teenager, not a chart-topping name. Standing in the wings that night as the Beatles sang, he later said something shifted inside him. Acting alone could never spark that kind of hysteria. That moment pushed him toward pop music, even though by 1965, he still hadn't scored a hit of his own. Mickey Dolenz' path began much earlier. In 1956, at just 11, he starred in the TV series Circus Boy under the name Mickey Braddock, playing Corky the Orphan Elephant Boy. The show ran 2 seasons and made him a child star, but by the early 1960s, the fame had faded. He was back in Los Angeles taking small guest roles, studying architecture, and fronting a bar band called Mickey and the One-Nighters. They played smoky clubs across Southern California, covering R&B songs and scraping by on small pay. Mickey hauled his own amps, drove home at 2 a.m., and sometimes earned less than his gas money. When he showed up for the Monkees audition in 1965, no one even mentioned his child star past. The producers only saw a tall, lively young musician who could sing, act, and make people laugh. He wasn't famous anymore, but he still carried the timing and spark of someone who'd once been in front of cameras before he even turned 21. Peter Tork's life couldn't have been more different. He came from Connecticut, but had drifted into the Greenwich Village folk scene in the early 1960s, playing tiny coffee houses like the Gaslight and Café Wa. He earned a few dollars a night, sometimes just tips, and often slept on floors of friends' apartments near Bedford Street. He played banjo and 12-string guitar, devoted to what he called real music. Stephen Stills, another struggling folkie, was his friend. When Stills auditioned for the Monkees and was turned down because of his teeth and hairline, he told the producers about Tork, saying he was a better-looking version of himself. At first, Tork refused to try. A commercial TV show about a fake band felt like everything he stood against. But by mid-1965, he was broke and out of options. He finally bought a one-way ticket to Los Angeles. Nervous but charming, he played his guitar and cracked jokes during the audition. He didn't realize that the silly TV gig he almost avoided would pull him out of the village coffee houses forever. Michael Nesmith came in with his own quiet ambition. Born in Dallas on December 30th, 1942, he had been writing songs and chasing a record deal for years. Under the name Michael Blessing, he had released a few singles since 1963, but none broke through. He wrote a song called Different Drum in 1964, a bitter breakup story that went mostly unnoticed until Linda Ronstadt's group, the Stone Ponies, turned it into a top 20 hit in 1967. By then, Nesmith was already famous as the one with the wool hat in the Monkees. Yet even as fans screamed for him, he was still fighting to be seen as a real songwriter instead of a comic TV character. Ironically, the producers had rejected Different Drum earlier, saying it wasn't a Monkees song, even though one of the Monkees had written it. The Monkees didn't start in a garage. They started in a boardroom. On April 16, 1965, producers Bob Rafelson and Bert Schneider sold Columbia Pictures on their idea for a Beatles-style TV show. Rafelson had been pitching the concept since 1962, but it wasn't until the Beatles films A Hard Day's Night and Help exploded worldwide that the studio finally said yes. By September 1964, they had already signed Davy Jones to a long-term Screen Gems contract, meaning one future Monkee was locked in a year before the band even existed. The real plan wasn't just TV, it was a business. Screen Gems created a new label, Colgems Records, to profit from record sales tied to the show. Long before auditions began, the money, marketing, and legal deals were already in place. The band, in other words, was designed to sell itself. In September 1965, casting ads appeared in Daily Variety and The Hollywood Reporter calling for folk and roll musician-singers aged 17 to 21 willing to play 4 insane boys. The response was overwhelming. 437 people officially auditioned, and hundreds more just showed up hoping for a shot. Stephen Stills tried but didn't make it, then recommended Peter Tork, who did. Only one of the 4 future Monkees, Michael Nesmith, came because he saw the ad. He even brought a bag of laundry with him. The producers loved it. It made him look like a real guy. The final picks were Davy Jones, Mickey Dolenz, Peter Tork, and Michael Nesmith, chosen as much for personality as for talent. To the studio, they weren't just musicians. They were types. Davy was the charming Brit, already a Tony-nominated Broadway performer. Mickey was the wild comic, the energy of the show. Peter was the sweet, naive folkie with real musical skills, but a goofball image. Michael was the thoughtful Texan with a songwriter's edge, instantly recognizable in his wool hat, which became his trademark. Together, they fit like pieces of a cartoon. The show could be planned around their traits before they even played a note. Contracts left no doubt about who held power. On January 17, 1966, NBC ordered 32 episodes of The Monkees. Screen Gems immediately set up Colgems Records and gave Don Kirshner full control of the music. He chose the songs, hired the session players, and approved every release. The Monkees were hired to sing, not play. Their debut album, released in 1966, went to #1 for 13 weeks, but they had almost no say in it. Kirshner even released their second record, More of the Monkees, in January 1967, without telling them, using a J.C. Penney photo as the cover. The band hated it, but legally, they couldn't stop it. They were employees of a machine built to look like a band. When The Monkees premiered on NBC on September 12, 1966, it broke every sitcom rule. Instead of still cameras and laugh tracks, it used fast cuts, handheld shots, and dream sequences like a pop version of the Beatles films. Each episode featured songs that doubled as early music videos. The strategy worked better than anyone predicted. Their first single, Last Train to Clarksville, released in August 1966, hit #1 by November. The debut album ruled the charts for 78 weeks. The show only ran from 1966 to 1968. Yet in that short time, the Monkees scored 4 consecutive #1 albums and became one of the biggest pop acts in America. The truth behind the music was stranger. The Monkees didn't play their instruments on their early records. The studio used top LA session players from the Wrecking Crew, while the 4 actors added only vocals. Mickey later admitted he was made the drummer just for TV, even though he was really a guitarist. Don Kirshner's plan was simple. The show sold the fantasy of a self-contained rock band, while professional musicians made the real records. Still, the illusion worked. In 1966 and 1967, their first 2 albums dominated the charts. The debut stayed #1 for 13 weeks. More of the Monkees spent 70 weeks on the Billboard 200, holding #1 for 18 of them, and became one of the biggest albums of the decade. I'm a Believer, written by Neil Diamond, hit #1 on December 31, 1966, and stayed there 7 weeks. None of the Monkees played instruments on it. Mickey sang the lead, and the rest was handled by session pros. But fans didn't care. Their faces were everywhere. and their records sold in the millions. Yet fame came with resentment. Michael Nesmith, who had written real songs for years, grew angry at being called a fake. He said it felt like wearing another man's clothes. He began pushing for creative control, wanting the group to record as a real band. The tension peaked at the Beverly Hills Hotel in January 1967. Don Kirshner arrived with gold records and royalty checks worth around $250,000 each, proof his system worked. The label lawyer reminded them that Kirshner had total authority. Nesmith snapped. He slammed his fist through a wall and said, "That could have been your face." That outburst became legend. The fake monkey had just punched back. A compromise followed. The band could record one single on their own. They chose All of Your Toys and The Girl I Knew Somewhere, songs they actually played on. But legal issues stopped the first one from being released, and Kirshner soon ruined his own position. In February 1967, he secretly shipped a Canadian single labeled My Favorite Monkey, Davy Jones Sings, pairing two outside tracks he had produced without approval. It violated everything they had agreed on. The single was recalled, and Kirshner was fired. In early 1967, the Monkees walked into RCA's Music Center of the World in Hollywood with something to prove. For a year, they had been the Punchline, a television band that mimed to tracks cut by Los Angeles session pros. Then Don Kirshner pushed out a single without their approval and lost his power. The door opened. Michael Nesmith stepped through it and brought in Chip Douglas from the Turtles, not as another handler, but as a producer who would let them actually be a band. Starting on 23rd of February and running until 18th of April 1967, the four Monkees locked themselves away in the studios on the corner of Sunset and Vine. In those rooms, mostly in Studio A and Studio C, they cut the bulk of 14 new tracks on their own. 7 of those songs were written or co-written by the band. Almost every note came from Mickey Dolenz, Mike Nesmith, Peter Tork, and Davy Jones, with Douglas mainly holding down the bass. In roughly 8 weeks, a manufactured television act turned itself into a functioning studio group. The wildest part is how unprepared Mickey had been at the start. When he was cast in 1965, he was not a drummer at all. He was a former child actor who faked drum parts on camera, then rushed to take daily lessons just so he would not get caught on close-ups. That emergency training slowly hardened into real skill. By the time they made the album that became Headquarters, he was playing drums on most of the tracks for real. He added timpani, guitar, even zither, and still found the breath to sing several lead vocals, including his own song Randy Scouse Git. Around him, Peter Tork turned into the group's all-purpose toolbox, moving between keyboards, bass, and banjo whenever a song needed it. Nesmith quietly became the band leader, controlling guitar parts and arrangements. Even Davy, the supposed cute frontman, shifted into a real working musician, adding percussion and occasional bass instead of just riding on fully ghost-played tracks, like the ones that had made up their 1966 debut. Inside RCA's Hollywood complex that spring, they did not move like a glossy network product. They worked like a young garage band that had somehow wandered into a major studio and refused to leave. Session logs show long blocks that started in the early afternoon and pushed straight through the evening. On 24th February, they ran from 1 p.m. until 7:30 p.m. On 10th March, and again on 18th March, they went from noon until midnight. They experimented live in those rooms instead of building songs from perfectly polished layers. Chip Douglas kept the arrangements open, so the edges stayed visible. You can hear little mistakes in songs like You Told Me and For Pete's Sake, rough banjo fills, a heavier drum feel that sometimes shoves the beat forward instead of sitting politely behind it. The whole record runs a tight 30 minutes and 52 seconds, and that rawness across such a compact set is what later critics point to when they call Headquarters the band's declaration of independence. Headquarters hit United States record stores on 22nd May 1967, and almost immediately found itself thrown into a strange kind of heavyweight fight. Only a few days later, on 26th of May, the Beatles released Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band in the United Kingdom, with the United States release following on 2nd of June 1967. For part of that summer, The two albums sat side by side at the very top of major American charts, trading the top two spots, while kids argued in bedrooms over which one to play next. One fan built chart history notes that Headquarters sold more than 2 million copies in roughly its first 2 months, which proved that the public would buy a Monkees record even when the band itself, not studio aces, was doing the playing. At the same time, Sgt. Pepper went on to spend 15 weeks at #1 on the Billboard chart and 27 weeks at the top in the United Kingdom. Looking back, it gave this odd television group the strange honor of being the main commercial rival to a record that would later be called one of the greatest albums of all time. The sweet taste did not last. Headquarters showed the world that the Monkees could act like a real band, but the highest sales were still tied to the earlier, more controlled era. In 1967, they did something no one else has ever matched. They became the only act to land 4 #1 albums on the Billboard 200 in a single calendar year. The Monkees, More of the Monkees, Headquarters, and Pisces, Aquarius, Capricorn, and Jones Lahated all reached the top. That record still stands. Yet the most tightly managed of those albums, More of the Monkees, which had come out in January 1967, with its fully controlled studio approach, was also the best-seller. As the band used more of its own material and moved further away from the original television formula through late 1967 and into 1968, ratings and sales began to slide. Their artistic freedom, which had felt like a victory inside the studio, slowly turned into a business problem that helped set up cancellations, lineup changes, and the breakup that followed. Pisces, Aquarius, Capricorn, and Jones Lahated arrived in United States shops on 6th November 1967, with a different kind of rebellion built into it. Now, the band was not just fighting for instruments and writing credits. They were reaching for new sounds, even if it meant leaning again on hired help. The record used one of the very first Moog synthesizers on the West Coast. Mickey first encountered the Moog at the 1967 Monterey Pop Festival, was so struck by it that he bought one of his own and brought that alien machine into the Monkees world. On songs like Daily Nightly and Star Collector, you can hear those wandering, swirling Moog lines replace ordinary keyboard parts and push the band toward a more psychedelic, futuristic texture. At the same time, they quietly returned to some studio support. Top drummer Eddie Howe handled much of the drum work. Chip Douglas again directed sessions and blended the playing of studio pros with the performances of the four Monkees. The gamble worked at the cash register. The album became their 4th straight United States #1 and sold more than 3 million copies, even as the wider music scene at the end of 1967 was turning darker, heavier, and more serious. Then came the moment when they tried to burn down their own image on screen. In late 1968, the Monkees helped write a film called Head that played in United States theaters starting 6th November 1968. The script credit included a then little-known Jack Nicholson as co-writer. Instead of a fun, teen-friendly movie, it opened with Mickey Dolenz walking calmly across a bridge and jumping off. From there, the film dove into a chaotic collage of war footage, commercials, and scenes where the band literally called itself a manufactured image. Again and again, the movie showed them trapped in a black box, pounding at the walls and unable to escape the television machine that had created them. In one brutal sequence, screaming fans actually tear the four of them apart, turning bubblegum fame into horror. Columbia put money into a mysterious billboard campaign that only displayed the word head and an image, hoping curiosity would bring crowds. Instead, the symbolism and broken, non-linear story confused the teenagers who had once tuned in every week. The film barely touched the box office in 1968 and helped speed up the collapse that was already underway. The television show that had made them famous had its own clock ticking in the background. The Monkees series debuted on NBC on 12th of September 1966, right in the middle of the youth wave that also carried Batman and the British invasion into American living rooms. At first, it fit perfectly. By the spring of 1968, it no longer did. The country was watching Vietnam footage and political assassinations on the nightly news. Against that backdrop, bright slapstick comedy and quick-cut song inserts began to feel out of phase. Over 2 seasons, NBC aired only 58 original episodes. The final new show went out on 25th of March 1968. Reruns filled the schedule until September that year. Then the network moved on. Ratings had dropped sharply in the second season as viewers grew older and rock culture drifted toward Jimi Hendrix, Cream, and underground FM stations, while the Monkees were still singing 2-minute pop songs between skits. Behind the scenes, the band's push for musical control strained relations with the producer. NBC rejected their idea for a looser, more music-centered third season. When the cancellation finally arrived, they still had hit singles on the charts, but their main lifeline, the weekly show that had created Monkey Mania in 1966, was gone. No one felt the strain more than Peter Tork. By late 1968, he was only 26 years old, yet he already felt used up by a schedule that never stopped. A mix of touring, constant recording, television taping, and a demand that he stay endlessly goofy on camera. He wanted a band that could stretch out, jam, and experiment. Instead, he felt stuck inside a franchised pop machine that gave him less and less joy. After a tiring Far East tour in September and October 1968, and the exhausting taping of an experimental NBC special titled 33 1-3 Revolutions per Monkey, he made a drastic choice. He decided to buy himself out. The contract still had 4 years left on it. It was reported that he paid around $150,000 for each of those years, something like $600,000 in total, an enormous amount in 1968 that erased much of what he had earned with the group and left him close to broke. News of his departure filtered out between late 1968 and 1969, with some accounts giving a formal quitting date of 30th of December 1969. Instead of waiting for future Monkees nostalgia money, Tork walked away, formed a new band called Release, and played on projects such as George Harrison's Wonderwall soundtrack, chasing credibility even if it cost him security. His search for a new life in the early 1970s collided with the law. In 1972, while traveling from Texas into Oklahoma, Peter was caught carrying hashish. He was convicted and sentenced to 3 months in an Oklahoma state penitentiary. The man who had drawn millions of viewers on Monday nights in the mid-1960s now spent his days on a prison farm doing manual labor instead of music. The contrast with the screaming crowds of only 5 years earlier could not have been sharper. When he got out, he did not return to television stardom. He moved to Marin County in California, joined a 35-voice community choir, and played guitar in a small shuffle blues band called Osceola. To pay the bills, he took day jobs, including teaching at a private school. The teen idol had been replaced by a working musician who was simply trying to stay afloat after fame and addiction struggles. While Peter was rebuilding quietly, Mike Nesmith made a very different gamble. In the middle of 1969, as the glow from the television years was fading, he walked into RCA and cut a deal that must have looked strange to the label. He wanted to release country rock records built around pedal steel guitar under the name The First National Band. Between 1970 and 1971, he put out 3 albums in roughly 12 months. Magnetic South, Loose Salute, and Nevada Fighter all arrived years before the Eagles turned this sound into a stadium standard. The singles did not come close to the old Monkees' heights. Joanne reached only number 21 on the Billboard Hot 100 in 1970, and Silver Moon stalled at number 42. Crowds who had once driven their records to number 1 were largely elsewhere. Yet critics later looked back at those same albums and called them early blueprints for country rock. On stage, Nesmith sometimes begged MCs not to mention that he had been a Monkee, but club audiences still shouted for Last Train to Clarksville. The past was always there in the room with him. In the background, his family story quietly changed the rules. While he struggled to sell a few 100,000 records, his mother, Bette Nesmith Graham, was selling up to 25 million bottles of liquid paper each year. She had started the product in the 1950s under the name Mistakeout, mixing tempera paint at her kitchen table to cover typing errors. By 1968, she owned a Dallas headquarters and an automated plant turning out roughly 1 million bottles annually. In 1979, just as the age of music video was about to explode, she sold liquid paper to Gillette for at least $47.5 million in cash and stock. She died the next year, at only 56. Nesmith reportedly inherited a large share of that fortune, giving him a level of financial safety that his bandmates did not have. That cushion made it possible for him to fund experimental video projects that might have ruined another former television star. By 1981, instead of throwing his energy into a Monkees reunion full-time, Nesmith was writing odd hybrid pieces that were part comedy sketch and part music video, then stitching them into a 1-hour program he called Elephant Parts. The finished work ran about 60 minutes and packed in 41 short segments. There were fake commercials, surreal comedy bits, and full video clips for songs like Cruisin' and Rio. It was built specifically for the new home video market, released on formats such as VHS, Betamax, and Laserdisc. That same year, the National Academy of Recording Arts and Sciences created its first category for music video. Elephant Parts won the very first Grammy Award for Video of the Year, beating more traditional television and concert specials. The man whom critics had once brushed off as a fake television musician now held the first Grammy statue ever given for the form of music video that would dominate the next 2 decades. What came just before that was even more prophetic. In 1980, working through his company Pacific Arts, Nesmith created a program called Pop Clips for the children's network Nickelodeon. It was a simple idea with a hidden revolution inside it. The show was a half-hour of back-to-back music videos, connected by short introductions from a host, the same kind of relaxed visual jockey style that later became famous on another channel. Pop Clips aired on Nickelodeon, but ownership sat with Warner Cable, whose executives quickly saw a bigger possibility. They wanted to buy the concept outright and expand it into a full-time channel built only around music videos. Nesmith did not want a life inside that corporate machine and chose a clean sale instead of ongoing involvement. Within months, Warner teamed with American Express and launched MTV on 1st August 1981 with Video Killed the Radio Star as its first clip. The new channel used almost the same format Pop Clips had tested, only now it ran around the clock and reached millions of cable homes. Once MTV took over youth culture in the 1980s, Nesmith's influence was everywhere, even when his name went unmentioned. The channel's basic loop, short narrative promos crafted specifically for songs, threaded together by hosts and little bursts of humor, felt like a merger of Pop Clips' curated playlists with the mix of sketches and videos inside Elephant Parts. By the time artists like Michael Jackson and Madonna were spending 6-figure budgets on single videos, obituaries and retrospectives were already talking about Nesmith as an architect of MTV and one of the first serious thinkers who treated music video as an art form instead of just advertising. The irony is hard to miss. 1/4 of a so-called prefab band had helped design the visual language that made more accepted rock groups look larger than life. Then, in 1986, a simple scheduling choice pulled the Monkees themselves back into view. MTV, looking for cheap content during a special Pleasant Valley Sunday marathon tied loosely to a 20th anniversary, decided to run nearly 24 hours of the Monkees television show from the 1966 to 1968 period. This happened in February 1986. Teenagers who had not even been born when the episodes first aired suddenly found themselves watching 4 hyper Beatles-style jokers tumble across the screen to songs like Last Train to Clarksville and I'm a Believer. The ratings stunned MTV executives. Within months, Mickey Dolenz, Davy Jones, and Peter Tork announced a 20th anniversary tour that would start in June 1986. They booked state fairs and arenas in cities such as Denver, Detroit, and Los Angeles, drawing crowds of 10,000 to 20,000 people. Michael Nesmith mostly stayed out of it, absorbed in his Pacific Arts video work and other projects, but he did appear once at the Greek Theater in Los Angeles for a symbolic reunion moment. Suddenly, that old television band the one many critics had never taken seriously, was selling out venues again in the age of synthesizers and big hair. From the outside, the reunion years between 1986 and 1989 looked like a warm victory lap. Inside, they reopened every old argument about who owned what. The tours often billed Dolenz, Jones, and Tork simply as the Monkees, even though the legal trademarks rested with corporate owners tied to Columbia Pictures and later Rhino. That meant the men whose faces had built the brand had to license their own name to tour. Fans wanted all four together, but Nesmith's absence created a kind of two-level fandom. One large group saw the trio at fairs and arenas during those late 80s years. A smaller and almost mythical group saw all four members together for the short Eustace Project and a handful of shows in 1996. Later changes, from Tork stepping away from some concerts in 2001 to Davy Jones's death in 2012, kept bringing back the same question. Was the real Monkees lineup the original four on television? The touring trio that did most of the reunion work? Or simply whoever happened to be on stage at a given time? While fans argued, the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame stayed silent. The hall opened in 1986. The Monkees became eligible in 1991. 25 years after their 1966 debut, yet they have been skipped every single year. Journalists and insiders have often pointed to co-founder Jan Wenner as a central roadblock, saying he personally rejected the idea because the band began through a casting call instead of a garage. The irony bites hard. Many acts already in the hall, from polished vocal groups of the 1960s to carefully groomed pop stars of the 1990s, also relied on professional songwriters and elite studio musicians, just as the Monkees did on their earliest records. Yet in their case, the manufactured label stuck so completely that decades of talk have never turned into even a single official ballot position. They became the hall's most famous ongoing omission. Fans and sympathetic writers have responded in the only way they can, by piling up hard numbers. The Monkees sold more than 75 million records worldwide. Between 1966 and 1967, they spent 37 weeks at #1 on the United States album chart, with 4 consecutive albums at the top. During the peak of Monkey Mania in 1967, trade papers even reported that their records were outselling the Beatles and the Rolling Stones combined in the United States. Nesmith later admitted that claim was exaggerated, but the fact that it could be printed at all shows how huge they looked in that moment. Their television show used fast-cut musical segments, filmed like strange little short films, that anticipated the style of 1980s music videos almost 15 years before MTV existed. On headquarters, they fought off the people who wanted to control them, played their own instruments, and co-wrote much of the material. Many critics now argue that this single creative leap should be enough to put them into the hall. In the end, even death has not settled the argument over how real they were. Davy Jones died suddenly of a heart attack in Florida on 29th of February 2012 at the age of 66. Closing the door forever on the possibility of all four sharing a stage again. Peter Tork passed away on 21st February 2019 in Connecticut at 77, after a long fight with a rare form of tongue cancer. That left Mickey Dolenz and Michael Nesmith to announce a farewell tour in 2021. Nesmith was already visibly frail, but he finished that run of shows with Dolenz. On 10th of December 2021, only weeks after their final performance, he died at 78. Mickey Dolenz became the last surviving Monkee. For some people, their origin as a scripted television band will always make them a joke. For others, those dates and those records mark the lifespan of a group that quietly stitched together television pop, experimental film, and self-directed rock long before the music business understood how powerful that mix could be.